Hello everyone, and welcome to another journey into the unknown. This is your host, and you have found your way to Forbidden Mysteries. I know many of you use these stories to help you drift into peaceful sleep. So before we begin, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Make sure to hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest mysteries. I would love to know where you are listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop a comment below and let me know. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind prepare to wander into the mysteries that lie just beyond our understanding. My name is Marcus Chen, and I am from Seattle, Washington. I have always been passionate about photography, specifically wilderness and landscape photography. There is something about capturing the raw beauty of nature that has always called to me. For years I had been visiting the Canadian Rockies, driving up from Seattle whenever I had the chance. Jasper National Park became one of my favorite destinations. The mountains there are different from anything we have in Washington. They are more dramatic, more isolated, more pristine. I had made the trip at least a dozen times before the incident that changed my life forever. In January of 2021, I decided to take a solo trip specifically to photograph the aurora borealis. I had checked the solar activity forecasts and everything pointed to prime viewing conditions. I rented a remote cabin about 45 minutes from the nearest town, deep in the backcountry, accessible only by a rough logging road that required four-wheel drive. The cabin was basic but sufficient. It had a wood stove, a bed, and most importantly, it was surrounded by absolute darkness at night. No light pollution for miles in any direction. Perfect conditions for astrophotography. I packed all my professional camera equipment, multiple lenses, tripods, battery packs, and enough cold weather survival gear to last me a week in case I got snowed in. The temperature forecast showed lows reaching -30°C, so I came prepared. The first 2 nights were productive. I captured some decent aurora shots, nothing spectacular, but solid work. The third night, January 18th, started like any other. I had my camera set up on the tripod outside around 2 in the morning. The sky was perfectly clear, not a single cloud. The stars were so bright and numerous that I could see my shadow cast by starlight alone. The temperature had dropped to exactly -30°C according to my thermometer. The cold was so intense that my breath froze instantly, creating tiny ice crystals that hung in the air. I was dressed in layers, my face covered except for my eyes, standing completely still to avoid generating any vibration that might blur my long exposure shots. That is when I noticed something unusual. At first I thought it was a satellite moving across my field of view. I see them all the time when doing night photography, and they are usually easy to identify by their steady, predictable movement across the sky. But this light was different. It was moving in a straight line initially, but then it stopped. Just stopped mid-flight and hung there in the sky. I lowered my eye from the camera viewfinder and watched it with my naked eyes. The light began to increase in brightness, growing from a point to a small disk. Then a second light appeared from a completely different direction. It moved toward the first light and also stopped. A third light appeared. All 3 lights began moving in a coordinated pattern, creating shapes against the stars. They formed a perfect triangle, then shifted into a straight line, then arranged themselves in a circle. The movements were precise, mechanical, impossible for any aircraft I knew of. I stood there watching, my photography completely forgotten. The 3 lights converged into a single point of bright white light. That single light began descending. Not falling, but descending in a controlled manner, and I realized with growing alarm that it was coming directly toward my location. I could see it growing larger, dropping below the tree line in the distance, approaching over the frozen lake that sat about half a mile from my cabin. As it came closer, the light began to resolve into something solid. A craft emerged from the luminescence. It was triangular in shape, dark, with lights positioned at each of the 3 corners. The size of it was staggering. I would estimate it was at least as large as 3 football fields laid end to end. The craft approached in complete silence. There was no sound whatsoever. No engine roar, no mechanical hum, nothing. Just the absolute silence of the frozen wilderness. It stopped and hovered approximately 100 feet above the frozen lake. maybe 200 feet from where I stood. I could see it clearly now. The surface appeared metallic, reflecting the moonlight in a way that revealed panels and seams. It was a constructed object, technological and utterly foreign. As I watched, a beam of light shot down from the center of the craft. It was not like a searchlight. It was more coherent, more focused, like a solid column of white light. The beam hit the surface of the frozen lake approximately 200 meters from my position. Within that beam, something descended. I could see shapes moving down through the light coming from the craft to the ground. Every instinct I had told me to run, to get inside the cabin, to hide. But a stronger instinct kept me frozen in place. Curiosity, wonder, terror and awe mixed together in a way that paralyzed my ability to make rational decisions. I had to know what I was seeing. I had to see them. Without thinking it through, I started walking toward the beam. I left my camera behind, trudging through the deep snow toward the frozen lake. The snow was up to my knees in places, making progress slow and exhausting. My breath came in rapid gasps, freezing my face, covering to my skin. It took me nearly 10 minutes to cover the distance to the lake's edge. I stopped approximately 50 meters from where the beam touched down, close enough to see clearly. There were figures there, 3 of them. They stood in the beam of light, and their appearance matched descriptions I had read in accounts I had always assumed were fiction or delusion. They were tall, perhaps 6.5 to 7 feet in height. Their bodies were thin, almost impossibly so, with long limbs that seemed too delicate to support their weight. Their skin, if you could call it that, was a gray color, smooth and without any visible texture or clothing seams, but it was their heads that held my attention. Disproportionately large compared to their bodies, with huge black eyes that had no whites, no pupils, just solid black ovals that dominated their faces. The 3 beings were standing in a triangular formation, and they appeared to be examining something on the ice. One held a device of some kind, pointing it at the frozen surface. Another was bent down, touching the ice with its long fingers. As I watched, all 3 of them stopped what they were doing simultaneously. They turned in perfect unison and looked directly at me. The moment their eyes focused on me, I felt something I cannot adequately describe. It was not physical, not exactly. It was as though something pushed into my mind. Not painfully, but invasively. I felt a presence inside my thoughts, examining, probing, learning. Images began flooding my consciousness. Mathematical symbols I did not recognize. Star charts showing constellations from perspectives I had never seen. Diagrams of what looked like DNA helixes, but far more complex than anything I had studied in school. The information came too fast, overwhelming my ability to process it. I tried to move, tried to run, tried to scream. Nothing happened. My body was completely paralyzed. I could breathe, I could blink, but I could not move my limbs or turn my head. The beings began moving toward me. They did not walk so much as glide across the snow, leaving no visible tracks. Their movements were fluid, graceful, and utterly alien. One of them reached me first. It stopped approximately 3 feet away, and up close I could see details I had missed from a distance. Its skin was not smooth, but had an almost translucent quality, as though I could see layers beneath the surface. Fine lines covered its body in geometric patterns. The being extended one of its hands toward my face. The hand had 4 fingers, each impossibly long and thin, with joints that bent in ways human fingers do not. The being's finger touched my forehead just above my left eye. The moment contact was made, I felt 2 contradictory sensations simultaneously. Pain. Sharp, burning pain that felt like my skull was being split open. But also euphoria. A wave of peace and contentment that made the pain almost irrelevant. In my mind, I saw a vision. Earth, our planet, seen from space. Beautiful and blue and fragile. Then the image changed. The earth began to darken. The green spaces turned brown. The oceans turned black. I was being shown something, a warning or a prediction. I saw timelines collapsing, futures ending. Then the image shifted again, showing me possibilities, choices, paths that could be taken or avoided. The being removed its finger from my forehead, and instantly the connection broke. I gasped, drawing in a lungful of frozen air that burned my throat. The paralysis released, and I collapsed forward onto my hands and knees in the snow. I looked up and saw all three beings backing away from me, returning to the beam of light. They stood in formation again, and the beam began to retract, pulling them upward. Within seconds they were gone, drawn back into the craft. The lights on the triangular craft pulsed once, twice, 3 times. Then the craft shot straight upward at a speed that should not have been possible. One moment it was there, the next, it was a point of light among the stars, and then it was gone completely. I knelt there in the snow, shaking. I do not know if I was shaking from the cold or from shock or from both. I checked my watch. It read 6:47 in the morning. That could not be right. When I had set up my camera, it had been just after 2 in the morning. I had watched the lights for perhaps 15 minutes. The walk to the lake had taken 10 minutes. The encounter had felt like 5 minutes at most. But according to my watch, nearly 5 hours had passed. I had lost time. Hours of my life were simply gone, existing only as a vague sense of discontinuity. I forced myself to stand and made my way back to the cabin. My legs felt weak, unsteady. When I reached my camera, I checked it immediately. The battery was completely dead. Not just drained, but dead in a way that it would never charge again. The backup batteries I had brought were also dead. My cell phone was dead. My laptop was dead. Every electronic device I had brought with me was completely non-functional. I gathered my equipment with numb hands and stumbled into the cabin. I collapsed on the bed and fell into unconsciousness. When I woke, it was dark again. An entire day had passed. I sat up and immediately noticed something wrong. My left hand hurt. I turned on the propane lantern and examined my palm. There was a mark there, a pattern of lines arranged in a grid. It looked like a burn, but I had not burned myself on anything. The pattern was too precise, too geometric to be accidental. It was approximately 2 inches square, perfectly centered on my palm. The skin was raised and discolored, a pattern that resembled a circuit board or some kind of technological schematic. I packed my belongings in a panic and drove out of the mountains as soon as I felt capable of driving. Back in Jasper, I went directly to the RCMP detachment and filed a report. The officer who took my statement was professional but skeptical. He wrote everything down, took photos of the mark on my hand, but I could see in his eyes that he thought I was either lying or experiencing some kind of psychological episode. He did tell me almost reluctantly that there had been other reports from the park. Not many, but enough that there was an unofficial file. Weird lights, strange encounters, missing time. He said most people did not report these things because they did not want to be labeled as crazy. I returned to Seattle 3 days later. The mark on my hand faded over the next few weeks, but it never completely disappeared. You can still see it if you know where to look. Faint lines in my palm that should not be there, but the physical mark was not the worst part. 6 months after the encounter, I developed an autoimmune condition. My immune system started attacking my own tissues for no reason doctors could identify. I have been to specialists, undergone dozens of tests, and no one can tell me why it started or how to cure it. I also started experiencing sleep paralysis, something I had never had before in my life. Several times a week I wake in the night unable to move, and I see faces in the darkness. Gray faces with black eyes watching me from the corners of my room. I have spent the years since that night researching. I have read every account I can find of similar encounters. I have contacted other witnesses, joined online communities, attended conferences. I have learned that Jasper National Park has a long history of sightings. Banff as well. The Canadian Rockies seem to be a hotspot for this phenomenon. I do not know why. Maybe it is the remoteness, the lack of light pollution, the vast uninhabited wilderness. Maybe they are drawn to these places for the same reasons I was drawn there. Or maybe there is something about those mountains, something geological or magnetic that attracts them. I went looking for the northern lights that January night. I wanted to capture something beautiful and unexplainable. I succeeded, but not in the way I intended. I found something that was looking back. And whatever they showed me, whatever information they placed in my mind, it has changed me in ways I am still discovering. I know things now that I should not know. Mathematical concepts that make no sense but feel true. Star systems I have never studied but can visualize perfectly. And always the image of Earth dying unless something changes. I do not know if it was a warning or a prediction or simply their reality. But I cannot forget it, and I cannot shake the feeling that they are still watching, still waiting, still out there in the darkness above those ancient mountains. My name is Ricky Dawson, and I am from Boise, Idaho. I have been a long-haul trucker for 15 years now. I have driven just about every major route in the western United States and Canada, hauling everything from produce to machinery to one memorable time, a shipment of live chickens that made my cab smell like a barn for a month. The job is not glamorous, but it pays well, and I like the solitude. Just me, the road, and whatever comes through on the CB radio. I have had my share of strange experiences on the highway. You drive enough miles through enough empty country at enough odd hours and you see things. Weird weather, strange lights, the occasional drunk stumbling out of nowhere. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on a February night in 2019 on a stretch of highway in Saskatchewan. My route that month was Calgary to Winnipeg and back, twice a month like clockwork. I knew that drive like the back of my hand. The stretch through Saskatchewan is probably the most monotonous driving in North America. Just flat prairie in every direction, the road cutting through it like a ribbon laid across a table. In winter it is even worse. Everything is white and gray and frozen, and you can drive for an hour without seeing another vehicle or any sign of human habitation. It is beautiful in its own stark way, but mostly it is just empty. This particular night I was running behind schedule. I had gotten delayed in Calgary with some paperwork nonsense at the loading dock, and I was trying to make up time. I decided to push through the night instead of stopping at a truck stop to sleep like I normally would have. It was February, so the sun set around 5 in the evening and would not rise again until after 8 in the morning. That meant I was looking at 15 hours of darkness. I loaded up on coffee from the last truck stop, filled my thermos, grabbed a couple of energy drinks, and hit the road. By 3 in the morning, I was somewhere between Swift Current and Moose Jaw. I had not seen another vehicle in over half an hour. The highway was completely deserted. The temperature outside was minus 25 Celsius, and the heater in my cab was working overtime to keep me comfortable. I had the radio on playing classic rock. Boston was playing More Than a Feeling, and I was singing along because there was nobody around to hear how badly I sing. I was wide awake, alert, completely sober. This is important to state because of what happened next. I glanced in my rearview mirror, just a routine check, and I saw lights behind me. At first, I assumed it was another truck finally catching up, but the lights were approaching fast. Impossibly fast. In the span of maybe 10 seconds, they went from distant points in my mirror to close enough that I could see they were not on the road. They were above the road, hovering maybe 20 feet in the air. The lights were not white or yellow like headlights. They were multiple colors. Blue, green, red, white, all pulsing in a pattern that hurt my eyes to look at directly. The object, and I have to call it an object because I do not know what else to call it, overtook my truck on the driver's side. It moved past me smoothly, keeping pace for maybe 5 seconds. I got a clear look at it. It was disc-shaped, rotating slowly, with lights arranged around its circumference. The size was hard to judge in the dark, but I would estimate it was about as wide as a large house. Definitely not any aircraft I had ever seen, and I have seen plenty of planes and helicopters during my years on the road. This thing made no sound, no engine noise, no rotor blades, nothing. It was completely silent. As I watched, my radio suddenly cut to static. Not just lost the station, but went to pure white noise that filled the cab with a harsh buzzing. At the same moment, my truck's engine started sputtering. I could feel the power dropping, the whole rig shuddering like it was about to stall. My dashboard lights flickered on and off, and warning indicators lit up randomly. The tachometer needle was swinging wildly. I have driven trucks for 15 years, and I have never had a vehicle behave like that. The object moved in front of me, maybe 50 feet ahead, and just stopped. It hovered there directly in my path at the same height as my cab, completely blocking the road. I hit my brakes hard. On an icy road, that was a mistake. The truck started to jackknife, the trailer swinging out to the side. I fought with the steering wheel, pumping the brakes, doing everything I could to regain control. Somehow, probably more through luck than skill, I managed to straighten out and bring the truck to a complete stop. I sat there with my heart hammering in my chest. my hands shaking on the wheel, staring at this thing hovering in front of me. I grabbed my CB radio, intending to call for help. Dead. No power at all. I grabbed my cell phone from the holder on the dash. It showed no signal, which was not unusual out here. But what was unusual was watching the battery percentage drain in real time. It had been at 83%. As I watched, it dropped to 71, then 54, then 32, then 12%, all in the span of maybe 10 seconds. The screen went dark and the phone died completely. The interior lights of my cab started dimming. Even the digital clock on the dashboard faded until it was barely visible. Outside, the object was descending, settling onto the highway directly in front of my truck. As it touched down, a section of the underside opened and a ramp extended to the pavement. In the light spilling from inside the craft, I could see a figure emerging. It was tall, maybe 7 feet thin, with the classic gray alien appearance. Large head, huge black eyes, stick-thin limbs. Right behind it came a second figure, and this one was different. It was more insect-like. Long segmented limbs, a triangular head, movements that were jerky and mechanical. I sat frozen in my seat as both beings walked down the ramp and approached my truck. They separated, one moving to each side. The gray one came to the passenger side and stopped at the window. It raised one of its hands and tapped on the glass with long fingers. 3 taps, deliberate, patient. Then I heard a voice in my head. Not in my ears, in my head. It said clear as anything. Do not be afraid. We need information. The voice had no accent, no emotion, just flat words appearing in my mind. I yelled back, not caring that it probably could not hear me through the glass and certainly would not understand English anyway. I said, I am a truck driver. What information could I possibly have? The gray being tilted its head, studying me. Meanwhile, the insectoid one had moved to the back of my truck and appeared to be examining my trailer. I was hauling agricultural equipment parts. Nothing special, nothing secret, just tractor components and irrigation system pieces. The gray being turned back to me and pointed at me with one long finger, then pointed at the craft behind it. The gesture was universal. It wanted me to come with them. I shook my head violently and yelled, "No! Hell no! I'm not going anywhere with you." I probably used more profanity than that, but you get the idea. The being seemed confused by my reaction, its head tilting the other direction like it was trying to understand why I was upset. The insectoid one returned from examining my cargo and communicated with the gray one. I could hear clicking sounds, rapid and complex like some kind of language. Both beings then turned their attention back to me. The passenger door handle started moving. I had not unlocked it. The doors were locked. But the handle moved anyway, and I heard the electronic lock disengage with a click. The door swung open on its own. The gray being reached into my cab and grabbed my wrist. The touch was shocking. Its skin, or whatever it was, felt ice cold and burning hot at the same time. The sensation was so intense that I yelped in pain. The being pulled, trying to drag me toward the open door. It was surprisingly strong for something so thin. I grabbed the steering wheel with my other hand and held on for dear life. We engaged in this absurd tug of war, the creature pulling my arm, me gripping the steering wheel and screaming. I do not know how long it lasted. It felt like forever, but was probably less than a minute. Then suddenly the being released me. Both creatures turned away from my truck and moved rapidly back toward their craft. I looked ahead and saw why. Headlights were approaching from the east. Another vehicle was coming. The craft's lights intensified, becoming almost too bright to look at. The ramp retracted with mechanical speed, the opening sealed shut, and the entire craft shot straight up into the sky. I have never seen anything accelerate that fast. 1 second it was on the ground, the next it was a point of light among the stars, and then it was gone. The whole departure took maybe 2 seconds. The approaching vehicle was a pickup truck. It pulled up next to my stopped rig, and an older man in a winter coat got out. He had to be in his 60s, weather-beaten face, the look of someone who had spent his whole life working on the prairie. He walked up to my window and I rolled it down. Before I could say anything, he said, "I saw the lights from my farmhouse. You okay, son?" I tried to explain what had just happened, the words tumbling over each other. He did not look surprised. He did not look skeptical. He just nodded and said, "You are the 5th person I have met this happened to on this stretch of highway." He drove with me, following in his truck, all the way to the nearest RCMP detachment in Moose Jaw. The officer on duty took my statement seriously, which surprised me. He mentioned that Transport Canada had a file on incidents along the Trans-Canada, and that mine was not the first report from this area. I showed him my wrist. Where the gray being had grabbed me, there was a burn mark. It was in the shape of a handprint, but with 5 fingers that were each too long, too thin. The skin was red and blistered in that pattern. The officer called my trucking company and explained that my truck had experienced a mechanical failure and would need to be towed. When the mechanics examined it the next day, they found that the truck's entire computer system was fried. Every electronic component had to be replaced. The company's insurance covered it without asking too many questions, which made me wonder if this had happened to other drivers for the same company. The surveillance camera system on my truck had been running during the encounter. The footage showed lights incredibly bright and overexposed, but you could not make out any details of the craft itself. The audio, however, was clear. You could hear me screaming, and underneath my voice you could hear clicking sounds. The same clicks I had heard the beings using to communicate with each other. I took 3 weeks off after that. I could not bring myself to get back in a truck. When I finally returned to work, I made one firm rule: no more Saskatchewan night runs. I will drive through during daylight, or I will take a different route entirely. My company was surprisingly accommodating about this, which again made me suspect I was not the first driver to make such a request. I found an online forum for truckers who have had similar experiences. It turns out there are dozens of us, maybe hundreds. Certain routes have a reputation. The Saskatchewan Prairie is one. Northern Ontario near Sudbury is another. New Brunswick along Route 2. There are hotspots where these encounters happen more frequently. Drivers talk about it quietly, sharing information, warning each other which stretches to avoid after dark. The burn on my wrist healed, but it left a scar. You can still see the outline of those 5 elongated fingers if you look closely. I showed it to a doctor during my next physical. He had no explanation for the pattern. Burns do not naturally form that shape. He wrote it in my medical file as scar of unknown origin and moved on. I still drive trucks. It is what I know, what I am good at, but I am more careful now about when and where I drive. I avoid empty highways after midnight. I avoid the known hotspots, and if I see lights in my rearview mirror that do not look right, I pull over and wait for them to pass. I have driven through blizzards, across black ice, through brake failures and tire blowouts. Nothing scares me like those empty prairie highways after dark. Something is watching those roads and they are not shy about making contact. I was lucky. That farmer showed up when he did and those things let me go. But I think about what would have happened if I had been pulled into that craft. Where would they have taken me? What would they have done? Would I have come back? I do not have answers to those questions, and I am grateful for that, because the answers are probably worse than anything I can imagine. My name is Vanessa Park, and I am from Portland, Oregon. I was a graduate student in environmental science back in 1996, working on my master's thesis about permafrost degradation and climate change. My research took me to some pretty remote locations, but nothing compared to the Yukon Territory in December. I was part of a small team of 4 researchers stationed at a field research cabin about 30 miles outside of Whitehorse. The isolation was extreme. We were surrounded by boreal forest, frozen lakes, and mountains. The nearest town was a 40-minute drive on icy roads, and we only made the trip once a week for supplies. The rest of the time, we were completely on our own. December in the Yukon is dark. The sun barely makes an appearance, rising late and setting early, giving you maybe 5 or 6 hours of gray twilight at best. The rest of the time it is night. Deep, cold, endless night. The temperature regularly dropped to minus 35 Celsius or colder. But the sky, when it was clear, was absolutely spectacular. The stars were so bright and so numerous that they cast shadows, and the northern lights, the aurora borealis, would dance across the sky in sheets of green and purple and red. On the evening of December 11th, I stepped outside the research cabin around 8:30 at night. I needed some fresh air after spending the entire day hunched over data tables and core samples. It was brutally cold, but I was dressed for it. Heavy parka, insulated boots, face mask, the works. The sky was perfectly clear that night, and the aurora was just beginning to show itself as faint green curtains in the northern sky. I stood there for a few minutes, just breathing and watching, enjoying the silence and the beauty. Then I saw movement that was not the aurora. At first I thought maybe it was, that I was just seeing a different pattern in the lights. But then I realized the movement was wrong. It was traveling horizontally across the sky, not vertically like aurora typically does, and it was moving at a steady speed, not flickering or waving. I focused my attention on it and saw that it was not just one light but a row of lights. 8 bright white lights arranged in a perfect rectangular formation, with additional red lights at what appeared to be the corners. I called out to the others inside the cabin. My 3 colleagues came rushing out, probably thinking something was wrong. We all stood there together, staring up at this formation of lights moving silently across the sky. One of them, a guy named David, ran back inside to grab a video camera. He came back out and pointed it at the sky, but within seconds the camera died. The battery was fully charged when he brought it out, but the screen just went dark. Another researcher, Sarah, tried her camera. Same result. Completely dead. We checked our watches. All 4 of us were wearing digital watches, and every single one had stopped at exactly 8:43. The formation of lights slowed as it approached our position, then appeared to descend. It was coming closer, and as it did, we could see that this was not 8 separate objects. It was one massive craft. The lights were arranged around its edges, and between them, we could barely make out a dark metallic surface against the night sky. The size of this thing was staggering. I am not exaggerating when I say it looked like an aircraft carrier flying overhead. It was enormous, easily the size of several city blocks. We stood there frozen, debating in hushed whispers whether we should run inside or keep watching. The craft continued its approach until it was directly above our research station. It stopped and hovered at what I estimated was about 500 feet altitude. We could see the underside of it now, illuminated by its own lights. Geometric patterns covered the surface, circles within hexagons, perfectly symmetrical. The exterior lights at the station began to dim significantly, as though the craft was somehow draining power. Inside the cabin, we could hear the radio equipment emitting strange sounds, pops and squeals and static bursts. I started to feel physically ill. A low-frequency hum filled the air, not heard so much as felt. It resonated in my chest cavity, making my heart feel like it was beating irregularly. 2 of my colleagues, David and Mark, both said they felt nauseous. Sarah, standing next to me, suddenly grabbed my arm and pointed at her face. Her nose was bleeding. I reached up and touched my own nose. My glove came away with blood on it. I almost never get nosebleeds, but here I was, bleeding freely in the freezing air. The snow on the ground beneath the craft began swirling in a circular pattern, despite there being no wind. The air was completely still, but the snow moved like it was caught in a vortex. The craft tilted slightly, maybe 10 or 15 degrees, and we could see more of its underside. The central section, a circular area in the very middle, began glowing brighter. The light intensified from white to pale blue to almost blinding white again. Then a beam shot down from that central point. Not at us, but about a quarter-mile away in the forest. The beam was so bright that it illuminated the entire area like daylight. Trees cast sharp black shadows. We could see every detail of the landscape. The beam remained focused on that spot for approximately 30 seconds, then retracted. The craft tilted back to horizontal, and then it was simply gone. Not gradually, not moving away, just gone. One moment it was there, the next moment the sky was empty again. We stood in shocked silence, looking at each other, looking at the sky, trying to process what we had just witnessed. Mark pulled back his sleeve to check his watch. It was still stopped at 8:43. Sarah checked hers. Same thing. We went inside and looked at the station's clock, which was plugged into the wall and not battery operated. It showed 9:37. We had lost 54 minutes. Our memories of the event felt like maybe 10 or 15 minutes had passed, but nearly an hour of time was simply missing. The emergency satellite phone still worked, and we used it to call our research coordinator in Whitehorse. Before we could even finish explaining what had happened, he told us he already knew. Over 30 calls had come in from residents across the Yukon reporting the same thing. The RCMP was receiving reports. The Canadian military was receiving reports. 4 different communities had seen the same object. We were not alone, not crazy, not mistaken. Whatever it was, it had been seen by dozens, maybe hundreds of people. At first light, around 9:30 the next morning, we hiked out to where we had seen the beam strike the forest. It took us almost an hour to reach the spot, trudging through deep snow. When we got there, we found a clearing. The vegetation was flattened in a perfect spiral pattern, radiating out from a central point. At the very center was a circle of scorched earth, maybe 20 feet in diameter. The snow had been completely vaporized. The ground beneath was burned black. We collected soil samples from the site, marking the locations carefully, documenting everything with photographs. We returned to Whitehorse 2 days later and were interviewed by Canadian Forces personnel. 2 officers in uniform came to our hotel. They were professional, polite, and revealed absolutely nothing. They asked us detailed questions about what we had seen, the timeline, the appearance of the craft, any physical effects we experienced. They took copies of our photographs and asked for the soil samples, which we refused to give up. Those were our research materials. They did not push the issue. The local news covered the story extensively. It became known as the Yukon UFO incident of 1996. There were newspaper articles, radio interviews, television segments. For a few weeks it was a big story. Then it faded, as these things do, replaced by other news. But for those of us who experienced it, it never faded. When I returned to my university in Oregon and mentioned the incident to my thesis advisor, he told me in no uncertain terms to never bring it up again. He said it would damage my credibility in the scientific community. He was not wrong. When I did mention it to colleagues, I saw the change in how they looked at me. Skepticism, pity, doubt. It became clear that if I wanted a career in science, I needed to keep quiet about what I had seen. Years later, documents were declassified showing that the Canadian military had tracked the object on radar. The record showed it had traveled the entire length of the Yukon Territory in 12 minutes. The speed required to cover that distance in that time is far beyond anything any known aircraft can achieve. The official conclusion was listed as unidentified aerial phenomenon, origin unknown. Not a weather balloon, not a satellite, not an experimental aircraft. Just unknown. I am a professor now, teaching environmental science at a university in Washington State. I have published dozens of papers on climate change, ecosystem dynamics, and permafrost studies. I am respected in my field, but I still have those soil samples from that December night in the Yukon, stored in a safe in my office. I had them analyzed by a lab that agreed to do the work quietly. The results showed unusual magnetic properties. The mineral composition was consistent with extreme heating, far beyond what any natural forest fire could produce. There were trace elements present that should not have been there, isotopes in ratios that made no sense. I believe in evidence, data, and reproducible results. I am a scientist. That is who I am and how I think. And the evidence from that night points to something we cannot explain with our current understanding of physics or technology. 4 trained scientists witnessed it. Dozens of civilians witnessed it. Military radar tracked it. Physical evidence was left behind. These are facts. What I cannot explain is what it was, where it came from, or what it was doing. But something was there. Something massive and technological and not from any nation on Earth. The data supports that conclusion, even if the conclusion itself seems impossible. I have stopped trying to convince people. I just present the facts when asked, and I keep those soil samples locked away as a reminder that there are things in this universe we do not yet understand, things that defy our assumptions about what is possible. My name is Tyler Kowalski, and I am from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I earned my Eagle Scout badge when I was 17, and I have been an outdoorsman my whole life. Camping, hiking, canoeing, survival skills, you name it. By the time I was in college, I had logged hundreds of nights sleeping under the stars in some pretty remote locations. So when summer break rolled around between my junior and senior year in 2018, I decided to do a solo canoe camping trip through Algonquin Provincial Park in Ontario, Canada. For those who do not know, Algonquin is massive. Over 7,000 square kilometers of pristine wilderness, with hundreds of lakes connected by portage trails. Most importantly, you can get deep into the interior where you will not see another human being for days. I planned a 7-day route through the backcountry, hitting some of the more remote lakes in the northern section of the park. I had all my gear dialed in: lightweight canoe, dry bags, water filtration system, fishing rod, camping equipment. I was completely self-sufficient. The route would take me through areas that were literally days of paddling and portaging from the nearest road. That level of isolation was exactly what I wanted. A week of silence, solitude, and nature. By day 4, I had reached a lake I will call Mirror Lake. That is not its real name, but I am not going to tell you exactly where this happened, because I do not need a bunch of UFO enthusiasts trampling through there, looking for evidence. It was a small lake, maybe a mile across, with a tiny island right in the center. The island was perfect for camping. High ground, Flat space for a tent, good tree coverage, and a natural rock shelf that made an ideal spot for a campfire. I set up my tent, filtered some water, and caught 2 nice-sized bass for dinner. It was a perfect evening. The sun set around 9 o'clock. It was mid-July, and being that far north, the twilight lasted for a long time. By the time it was truly dark, it was probably close to 10:30. There was no moon that night, which meant the stars were absolutely incredible. I have seen dark skies before, but this was something else. The Milky Way was a dense river of light overhead. I could see satellites moving, the occasional shooting star, and what I thought were a couple of planets. I was lying in my sleeping bag outside the tent because it was too beautiful to sleep inside. The air temperature was perfect, the bugs were minimal, and I was completely alone. It was exactly the experience I had been looking for. Around 11:30, I noticed what I thought was a satellite moving across the sky. I watched it out of idle curiosity. Then it stopped. Just stopped moving and hung there against the stars. I sat up, paying closer attention now. A second satellite appeared from a different direction and also stopped. Then a third. I was fully alert now, watching all 3 lights. They began moving again, but not in straight lines. They were moving in coordinated patterns, creating geometric shapes. First a triangle, then a straight line, then a circle. The movements were precise, mechanical, deliberate. These were not satellites. The 3 lights merged into a single bright point of light. That single light began descending, and I realized with a cold feeling in my stomach that it was coming toward my location. I stood up, watching it grow larger as it approached. The light resolved into something solid. A craft emerged, triangular in shape, dark against the stars, with lights positioned at each of the 3 corners. The size was difficult to judge at first, but as it came closer, I realized it was massive. Larger than any plane I had ever seen, it moved silently over the lake, coming directly toward the island where I stood. The craft stopped and hovered about 100 feet above the lake surface, maybe 200 feet from the island. There was no wind, no sound, just this massive object hanging in the air above the water. The water beneath it began rippling in a circular pattern, as though the craft was affecting the surface somehow. I was paralyzed with a mixture of fear and awe. Every instinct told me to run, to hide, to do something. But I could not move. I just stood there staring at it. A spotlight beam shot from the bottom of the craft. It swept across the lake surface, then moved to the shoreline, slowly scanning. The beam was approaching the island. I dove into my tent and grabbed the only weapon I had, which was a canoe paddle. I know how absurd that sounds, but it was all I had. The beam of light swept across the island, moving through my campsite. The interior of my tent began glowing bright white through the fabric. I could hear a humming sound now, a deep vibration that I felt in my chest more than heard. All the hair on my body was standing up. The air felt charged with static electricity. The beam stopped moving. It was centered on my tent. I could see my shadow cast against the tent wall by the intense light coming from outside. I do not know why I did what I did next. Maybe it was compulsion. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe I was just not thinking clearly. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside into the beam. I could not look away from the craft. My eyes were locked on it, drawn to it like a magnet. 3 sections of the underside began opening like the iris of a camera lens. From each opening, something descended. They were spherical objects about the size of basket cases with a chrome reflective surface. 3 of them, floating down through the beam of light descending toward the island. The spheres landed in a triangular formation around me, each one about 10 feet away. They hovered approximately 3 feet above the ground. As I watched, appendages extended from each sphere. Thin metallic arms with multiple articulated joints like insect legs but made of metal. At the end of each appendage were various tools and devices. One looked like a camera lens. Another looked like some kind of scanner. Others I could not identify at all. The spheres began circling me slowly. Their appendages extended, examining me from all angles. I tried to run. My brain was screaming at me to move, to get away, but my legs would not respond. I was frozen in place, unable to move anything except my eyes and head. The spheres continued their examination, scanning me with beams of red laser light that created a grid pattern across my body. One sphere approached closer than the others. An appendage extended toward my face. At its tip was a device that projected a hologram into the air between us. The hologram showed a star field, millions of stars in 3-dimensional space. One star was highlighted, growing brighter. The view zoomed into that star system, showing planets orbiting it. One planet was highlighted. It looked similar to Earth, blue and green, but the continents were wrong. The land masses were shapes I did not recognize. The hologram changed. Now it showed figures. Tall, thin beings with elongated limbs and three-fingered hands. They were standing in what looked like a greeting posture, hands raised. I realized what was happening. They were trying to communicate their origin to me. They were showing me where they came from. The hologram changed again, displaying what looked like mathematical formulas and chemical diagrams. Equations I did not understand. Molecular structures that looked far more complex than anything I had studied in my chemistry classes. They were sharing information with me, though I could not comprehend most of it. I tried to speak. I wanted to say something, anything, to communicate back. But no sound came out. My vocal cords would not work. The hologram continued to cycle through images. Star maps, planets, mathematical formulas, biological diagrams. Then suddenly there was a loud splash from the lake. A beaver, somewhere out in the darkness, had slapped its tail against the water. It is a warning behavior. Territorial aggression against intruders. The sound was sharp and loud in the silence. The spheres reacted instantly. Their appendages retracted with mechanical speed, pulling back into their bodies. All three spheres shot straight up, returning to the beam of light and disappearing back into the craft. The beam itself retracted, pulling back into the craft like it was being reeled in. The openings in the underside sealed shut, and the craft began to rise. It accelerated upward, over the tree line and into the sky, and then it was gone. The entire departure took maybe 3 seconds. One moment it was there. The next I was standing alone on a dark island in the middle of a lake, staring at empty sky. My legs gave out and I collapsed to the ground. I sat there shaking, trying to process what had just happened. Eventually I thought to check my watch. It had stopped at 11:47. I pulled out my phone from the tent. It was completely dead. It had been at 67% battery when I had last checked it before dark. I looked at my camp stove, which had a wind-up mechanical clock. It showed 4:23 in the morning. Nearly 5 hours had passed. But my memory of the entire event felt like maybe 15 minutes at most. Where had the time gone? What had happened during those missing hours? I looked at the fish I had caught for dinner. They were rotting. Not just old, but decomposed to the point of smelling foul. Those fish had been fresh just hours ago. The water in my bottle, which I had filtered fresh that evening, tasted stale and flat. Something was wrong with time. It had passed differently for me than it had for everything else around me. I packed my camp in a complete panic. It was still dark, probably an hour before sunrise, but I did not care. I loaded everything into my canoe and started paddling. I paddled for 3 straight hours through the darkness, using my headlamp to navigate. I was terrified that the craft would come back, that the spheres would return. I just wanted to get to civilization, to be around other people, to be somewhere that felt safe. I reached the nearest portage trail at first light and hiked out to the access road. I flagged down the first car I saw, a couple heading into the park for a day of fishing. They must have thought I was insane, this wild-eyed kid babbling about lights and spheres and missing time. But they gave me a ride to the park headquarters. The park ranger who listened to my story was surprisingly calm. He did not laugh, did not dismiss me, did not suggest I was mistaken. He just nodded and said, "You are the 3rd person this summer." He explained that there had been 2 previous reports from the same general area. Similar descriptions, lights in the sky, missing time. He told me about a hot zone in the park interior where sightings had been reported for decades. Most people did not report them because they did not want to be seen as crazy. But the rangers knew. They kept an informal file of these incidents. The ranger called my emergency contact, which was my parents, and arranged for them to come pick me up. I abandoned the rest of my trip. I could not go back out there. Not then, maybe not ever. When I got home, I noticed marks on my forearms. Circular patterns, faint but visible, in the exact spots where those laser grids had scanned me. The marks faded over about 2 weeks, but while they were there, they were undeniable physical evidence that something had happened to me. I have done a lot of research since that night. I have read every account I can find of similar encounters. Algonquin Provincial Park has a long history of UFO sightings. There are reports going back decades, and some of them specifically mention sphere-shaped drones doing examinations. I am not the only one. That should be comforting, I guess, knowing I am not alone in this experience. But mostly it just raises more questions. Why there? What are they looking for? How long has this been going on? I have camped in bear country, survived lightning storms, and paddled through serious rapids. But nothing in my outdoor experience prepared me for being studied by something from another world. They were not aggressive, just curious, and that is what scares me most. We are specimens to them, objects of study, and they have been doing this for a long time, in places where no one will believe the people who see them. My name is Denise Murphy, and I am from Detroit, Michigan. I have been a long-haul trucker for 22 years now. When I started back in the 90s, I was one of maybe a handful of women doing this job. It is still male-dominated, but I have earned my place and my respect in this industry. I have driven millions of miles across the United States and Canada, hauling everything you can imagine. I know the roads, I know the truck stops, and I know which routes to avoid when the weather turns bad. But there is one stretch of highway I will never drive at night again, no matter how good the weather is. Highway 11 in northern Ontario, specifically the section between Hearst and Kapuskasing. What happened to me there in October of 2015 changed everything I thought I knew about what was possible. My regular route back then was Toronto to Thunder Bay. I made the run twice a month, sometimes more if the company needed extra loads moved. Highway 11 through northern Ontario is notorious among truckers. It is remote, empty, and unforgiving. There are stretches of over 100 kilometers between towns. Cell service is non-existent for most of the route. If your truck breaks down out there, you could be waiting hours for help to arrive, especially at night. Some truckers call that stretch the Highway of Tears because of the number of people who have disappeared along it over the decades. Missing persons cases that were never solved, cars found abandoned, that sort of thing. It has a dark reputation. This particular night was in mid-October. I was doing a night run because I had gotten delayed in Toronto and needed to make up time. It was around 2 a.m, pitch black with a light rain falling. The kind of rain that is just heavy enough to need your wipers on intermittent, but not heavy enough to really clean your windshield. I was the only vehicle on the highway. I had not passed another car or truck in at least 45 minutes. I had my coffee, my country music playing, and I was focused on making good time. The load I was hauling was just lumber. Nothing special, nothing that would draw attention. Just a routine haul. I saw the lights in the sky ahead of me above the tree line. At first I thought they were tower lights from some kind of facility, or maybe the distant lights of a town. But as I got closer, I realized the lights were moving. Not in a straight line like a plane, but darting side to side. Erratic movements that no aircraft could make. There were 3 distinct orbs, each glowing with an orange-red color. They were descending, coming down toward the highway ahead of me. One by one, they crossed directly over the road. First one, then the second, then the third, moving in sequence like they were following each other. My radio suddenly started changing stations on its own. It cycled rapidly through AM and FM frequencies, never stopping on any one station for more than a second. Static voices, music, static voices over and over. I reached out to turn it off, but before I could, my truck's headlights started flickering. The engine power began to drop. I had my foot on the accelerator, but the truck was losing speed. I went from 90 kilometers per hour down to 70, then 60, then 50. The engine was not stalling, but it was like something was sapping the power from it. All 3 orbs moved into formation around my truck. One on the driver's side, one on the passenger side, and one directly above. Each orb was approximately the size of a car, glowing from within with that eerie orange-red light. I could not see any solid surface. They looked like balls of pure luminous energy. The rain was evaporating before it could touch them. I could hear a sizzling sound over the noise of my engine and the rain on the windshield. My CB radio came on by itself and a high-pitched tone screamed through the speaker. It was so loud and so piercing that it caused physical pain in my ears. I turned the CB off, but the tone continued. It was coming from the speakers whether the radio was on or not. The dashboard display started going haywire, numbers scrambling, warning lights flashing randomly, the fuel gauge swinging from full to empty and back again. My speedometer was reading 0 even though the truck was still moving. The orb on my driver's side descended until it was at the same level as my window, keeping exact pace with the truck. I was down to maybe 20 kilometers per hour now, barely rolling. The orb was close enough that I could see inside it. There were shapes moving within the light, humanoid silhouettes, 2 figures distinct against the glow, large heads, thin bodies, the classic gray alien appearance that you see in movies and books, except this was real, and it was right outside my window. I yelled at it, I do not remember exactly what I said. Probably something like, "What do you want?" Or maybe just incoherent screaming. The orb pulsed brighter in response to my voice, like it was reacting to the sound. The interior shapes became clearer. I could make out more detail. The beings had disproportionately large heads and those huge black eyes. One of them seemed to be looking directly at me. We made eye contact, and I felt something in my mind. Not words, but emotions. Curiosity, assessment, and something that felt almost like reassurance. Like it was trying to tell me they were not going to hurt me. The orb above my truck descended until it was hovering just above the trailer. The weight of my truck changed. I could feel it in the suspension, like I was suddenly carrying extra tons of cargo. The truck was compressing down on its springs. Then I realized what was happening. The orb was not just hovering above me, it was pulling the truck. My tires were losing contact with the road. First the trailer wheels lifted, then the drive wheels. I was rising into the air. 1 foot off the highway, then 2 feet, then 3 feet. My truck was floating, still moving forward slowly through the air, held by whatever force these orbs were exerting. I was screaming now, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. All 3 orbs moved in tight formation around my floating truck, and we were moving as a unit toward something ahead. I could see it now through the rain and darkness. A massive craft hovering over the trees, disc-shaped, maybe 200 feet in diameter, with bands of lights rotating around its edge. There was an opening in the underside, a bay door or entrance of some kind. They were taking me toward it. They were going to take my entire truck into that craft. We were within 100 feet of the craft when there was a sudden bright flash on the horizon. Lightning. A bolt struck somewhere nearby, close enough that the thunder boom arrived almost simultaneously. The sound was deafening, a physical shock wave that I felt as much as heard. The orbs reacted instantly. Their formation broke. My truck dropped back onto the highway with a hard landing that bottomed out the suspension and sent a jolt through the entire rig. The 3 orbs shot away at incredible speed, heading north and disappearing into the darkness in less than 2 seconds. The large craft also departed, accelerating straight up and vanishing from sight. I sat there in my truck, dead on the highway, engine off, all electronics offline, in complete darkness and silence except for the rain on the roof. I tried to process what had just happened. I checked myself over. No injuries, no marks, nothing physically wrong with me. The cargo in the trailer was still secured. Everything seemed normal, except nothing was normal. I tried to restart the truck, nothing. No response at all. The engine would not turn over, the dashboard stayed dark. I sat there for 10 minutes before trying again. This time the engine turned over and caught. The electronics gradually came back online, flickering to life one system at a time. I checked the clock on the dashboard. It showed 3:47 in the morning. The last time I had looked at the clock, right before I saw the orbs, it had been just after 2. Nearly 2 hours had passed, but my memory of the entire event felt like maybe 10 or 15 minutes at most. I had lost time, significant time, with no memory of where it went. I put the truck in gear and drove to Kapuskasing, the next town, which was about 40 kilometers down the highway. It was the longest 40 kilometers of my life. I kept checking my mirrors, scanning the sky, terrified that those orbs would come back. I pulled into a 24-hour truck stop in Kapuskasing and parked under the brightest lights I could find. I got out to inspect my truck with a flashlight. The exterior looked normal at first, but when I climbed up to check the trailer roof, I found marks. Handprints burned into the metal, but not human handprints. These had 3 fingers, each elongated and thin, arranged in a pattern that was definitely not human. There were multiple prints clustered near the front of the trailer, like something had been gripping it or holding it. Other truckers in the lot noticed me shaking and came over to see if I was okay. One of them, an older guy who had been driving these routes for decades, listened to my story without interruption. When I finished, he just nodded and said he believed me. He told me about his own encounter on Highway 11 8 years prior. Almost identical. Orbs, missing time, his truck being lifted off the road. He said Highway 11 is their corridor, and that dozens of truckers have reported similar experiences over the years. There is an unofficial communication network among drivers about hot zones, stretches of highway where these encounters happen more frequently. I reported the incident to my trucking company. The dispatcher was skeptical but filed an official report. When I got to Thunder Bay, the company mechanic inspected the truck thoroughly. He found that the computer system had significant data corruption. There were ghost entries in the logs showing elevation changes and something that looked like aerial navigation attempts. The computer had recorded the truck being airborne, which should have been impossible. The burned handprints on the trailer could not be explained. The insurance company eventually declared it weather damage and paid for the repairs, but I knew what it really was. I continued working as a trucker, but I made one absolute rule for myself. No more Highway 11 night runs. I will drive it during daylight, or I will take a completely different route even if it adds hours to the trip. My company was surprisingly accommodating about this request, which made me wonder how many other drivers had made the same demand. I found an online community of truckers who have had UFO encounters. There are hundreds of us, maybe thousands. We share information, warn each other about hot zones, compare experiences. Highway 11 in Ontario is one of the most active areas. The Trans-Canada through Saskatchewan is another. Route 2 in New Brunswick comes up a lot. These are not random occurrences. There are patterns, specific locations where these encounters happen repeatedly. The physical effects from that night took weeks to fully manifest. I developed recurring nightmares of being pulled into that craft, of waking up in some sterile room surrounded by those beings. I also developed what I can only describe as enhanced intuition. I can sense when they are near now. It is a feeling, a prickling on the back of my neck, a heaviness in the air. I have felt it 3 times since that night, all on remote highways at night. Each time I pulled over, turned off my lights, and waited until the feeling passed. I do not know if they are still monitoring me, or if I am just more sensitive to their presence now. People think truckers make this stuff up. They think we are tired or hallucinating from too much coffee and not enough sleep, or just looking for attention. But when 100 different drivers report the same thing on the same stretch of highway over the course of decades, you have to ask yourself what is really out there. I have driven millions of miles. I know what belongs in the sky and what does not. I know the difference between airplane lights and helicopter lights and tower lights. And whatever pulled my rig into the air that night does not belong to any government on Earth. I'm certain of that. Those orbs that craft those beings, they are not from here, and they are still out there, still watching those remote highways, still making contact with anyone unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. My name is Raymond Costa, and I am from Phoenix, Arizona. I am a geology hobbyist and mineral collector. I spend most of my free time hunting for interesting rock specimens, visiting mines, and exploring geological formations. In 2017, I became fascinated by the famous Stefan Michalak incident from 1967. For those who do not know, Michalak was a prospector in Manitoba who claimed he encountered a UFO near Falcon Lake. He approached the craft. It released some kind of heated gas that burned him, and he suffered radiation-like injuries. The case became famous because there was physical evidence, burns on his body in a grid pattern, his clothes scorched, soil samples from the site showing elevated radiation. It is considered one of the most credible UFO cases in Canadian history. I decided to make a trip to the area, both to do some prospecting of my own and to see the location where the original incident occurred. I am aware of the irony. I was deliberately visiting the site of a famous UFO encounter, thinking to myself, what are the odds it happens twice in the same spot? The odds, as it turns out, are not as low as I thought. I drove 1,400 miles from Phoenix to Whiteshell Provincial Park in Manitoba, which is where Falcon Lake is located. I set up a base camp and spent the first 2 days exploring the area, looking for quartz veins and interesting mineral deposits. On the 3rd day, I hiked into the bush with my prospecting tools. I had a rock hammer, a geology pick, sample bags, and a handheld GPS unit. The area is dense boreal forest, not easy terrain to navigate. I was maybe 2 kilometers from my camp, examining an outcropping of exposed bedrock when I heard a sound. At first I thought it was a generator from a distant cabin. It was a humming sound, mechanical, steady. But as it grew louder, the pitch increased. It became a high-frequency whine that made my teeth ache. The forest around me suddenly went silent. The birds stopped singing, the insects stopped buzzing. It was like someone had turned off all the ambient sound. The humming grew more intense until I could feel it in my bones, vibrating through my entire body. I recognized the similarity to the descriptions from the Michalak case. He had described a humming sound right before he saw the craft. I looked up through the tree canopy and saw 2 objects descending through the sky. They were glowing orange-red, elongated oval shapes moving in perfect tandem. Both were identical in size and appearance. The objects descended below the tree line into a clearing about 50 meters from my position. They were hovering about 15 feet above the ground, and the heat radiating from them was intense. I could feel it from where I stood. My skin felt like I was standing too close to a bonfire. One of the objects wobbled slightly, then settled onto the ground with a metallic thud that I felt through my boots. The second object remained hovering. As the glow from the landed craft diminished, I could see its surface. Smooth metal, seamless construction, no visible rivets or welds or seams. It looked manufactured, but not in any way I recognized. Openings appeared in the side of the landed craft. Rectangular doorways, maybe 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide. Geometric patterns around the openings began glowing with a pale blue light. I could hear sounds coming from inside the craft. Mechanical whirring, clicks and pops, and something that sounded almost like voices but not human. Too high-pitched, too rapid. I was hiding behind a large boulder watching this unfold, and I was faced with a choice. I could run, get out of there as fast as possible, or I could stay and document what I was seeing. I pulled out my phone to record video. The moment I activated the camera, the phone overheated in my hand. It went from normal temperature to burning hot in about 2 seconds. The screen went black and the phone shut down completely. I dug out my backup camera from my backpack, an old digital point-and-shoot that I keep for documenting rock samples. I turned it on, but the viewfinder just showed static. The device was functioning, but it could not capture an image. Something about the craft was interfering with electronics. I made a decision that I recognized was probably stupid. I moved closer. I crept from my hiding spot behind the boulder and moved to within about 30 meters of the landed craft. From this distance, I could see more detail. Panels on the surface, slight color variations in the metal, and those glowing geometric patterns that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the humming sound. 2 figures emerged from the craft. They were humanoid in shape, but definitely not human, about 5 feet tall with gray skin that looked smooth and slightly translucent. Their heads were disproportionately large, taking up maybe a third of their total body height. The classic gray alien appearance. They were wearing form-fitting suits that shimmered in the light, like they were made from some kind of metallic fabric. The beings moved around the exterior of their craft, examining something on the surface. They held handheld devices that they pointed at various sections of the hull, like they were scanning or taking readings. One of the beings looked in my direction. Its eyes were huge, completely black, with no whites or pupils visible. Just solid black ovals that dominated its face. The being made some kind of gesture or sound, and the other one turned to look at me as well. They both focused their attention on me, and I felt exposed, vulnerable. They began moving toward my location. Not running, just walking steadily in my direction with a fluid, graceful gait. I panicked. I stood up from my crouched position, intending to run. Then I heard a voice in my head. Not in my ears, in my head. A single word, stay. It was not a request. It was a command, and my body obeyed without my conscious decision. My legs would not move. I was frozen in place, unable to run or even turn away. The beings approached to within about 10 feet of where I stood. One of them extended a device toward me. It was a small rectangular object with a glowing panel on one side. A cone of light shot from the device, scanning me from head to toe. I felt warmth from the scan, not painful but noticeable. The second being produced a different device and pointed it at my head. Suddenly my mind was flooded with images, mathematical equations I did not understand. Star charts showing constellations from angles I had never seen, DNA helixes, far more complex than human DNA with additional strands. Diagrams of what looked like planetary systems, orbital mechanics, chemical formulas. The information came too fast. I could not process it. My nose started bleeding. I felt blood running down over my lip and dripping off my chin. The beings communicated with each other in a series of clicks and chirps, high-pitched sounds that hurt my ears. They seemed satisfied with whatever data they had collected from me. One of the beings approached closer within arm's reach. It extended one of its long, thin hands toward my jacket. I was wearing a field jacket with multiple pockets. The being's hand went directly to one of my pockets where I had put a piece of quartz I had found earlier. It removed the rock sample, examined it briefly, turning it over in its 3-fingered hand. Then it placed the rock into a bag or pouch attached to its suit. In exchange, it pulled out a different rock from its bag and placed it in my pocket. The rock felt smooth and warm through the fabric. Both beings backed away from me, returning to their craft. They entered through the doorway and the opening sealed shut behind them. I could not see how it closed. One moment there was a doorway, the next the surface was smooth and unbroken. The craft began glowing brighter, the orange-red light intensifying. The hovering craft positioned itself directly above the landed one. Then both craft lifted off simultaneously. They accelerated straight upward at a speed that should not have been possible. The trees around the clearing bent from the force of their departure. Within seconds they were gone, just points of light in the sky and then nothing. I collapsed to my knees. My legs gave out the moment the compulsion to stay released. I looked at my watch. The entire encounter had lasted approximately 8 minutes. I felt physically ill. A severe headache pounded behind my eyes. Nausea rolled through my stomach. My muscles felt weak, like I had just run a marathon. I remembered the rock the being had placed in my pocket. I pulled it out and examined it. It was smooth, almost perfectly spherical, about 2 inches in diameter. The color was black, but not like any mineral I recognized. It was warm to the touch, noticeably warmer than body temperature. I made my way back to my camp, but the hike that should have taken 30 minutes took nearly 2 hours. I kept having to stop and rest. My sense of balance was off and the headache was debilitating. When I finally reached my tent, I collapsed inside and fell unconscious. I do not know if I slept or passed out, but when I woke up, it was midnight. 14 hours had passed. I sat up and immediately noticed my face and hands were burned. It looked like severe sunburn, red and painful, but I had been in the forest shade all day. There had been no sun exposure sufficient to cause this level of burning. I packed my gear at first light and drove to Falcon Beach, the nearest town. I went directly to the medical clinic. The doctor examined the burns and had no explanation for them. He prescribed burn cream and pain medication, but he could not tell me what had caused them. When I mentioned that I had been at the site of the original Michalak incident, his expression changed. He knew the history of the area. He told me, almost casually, that I was not the first person to come into his clinic with similar burns and similar stories. He suggested I contact Chris Rutkowski, a Canadian researcher who studies UFO reports. I drove back to Phoenix with that strange black rock. I showed it to a geologist colleague at the community college where I take classes. He was intrigued and arranged for analysis at the university lab. The preliminary results showed unusual mineral composition. The elements present were in ratios that did not match any known terrestrial rock. There were isotopes present that should not have been there, or at least not in those proportions. The lab wanted to keep the rock for more extensive study. I refused. That rock is mine, or at least it was given to me, and I am not giving it up. I contacted the Canadian researcher the doctor had mentioned. He was very interested in my experience and told me that Falcon Lake and the surrounding area has had ongoing sighting activity since the original 1967 incident. Dozens of reports over the decades, many with similar details to mine. It is what researchers call a hotspot, a location where UFO activity seems to recur. He could not explain why certain locations attract repeated sightings, but the pattern is undeniable. The burns on my face and hands took about 3 months to fully heal. They left scarring faint but visible. The headaches continued for weeks, gradually decreasing in frequency and intensity. But the strangest effect is the dreams. I have recurring dreams about the planet they showed me and that mental download of information. I see it clearly, the continents, the oceans, the cloud patterns. I wake up and I can draw it from memory. I have never studied astronomy beyond basic high school science, but I can now identify constellations I have never learned. There is knowledge in my head that was not there before, planted by that scan or that mental contact or whatever it was they did to me. I still have that rock. I keep it in a safe in my apartment. Occasionally, I take it out and examine it. It is still warm, even after all these years. It should have cooled to room temperature long ago, but it maintains a temperature slightly above ambient. I do not understand the physics of that. Stefan Michalak told the truth. I know because it happened to me in the exact same place 50 years later. Whatever they are, they keep coming back to Falcon Lake. That site means something to them, and they are not done studying us, not done collecting samples, not done making contact. I was just one more data point in a study that has been ongoing for decades, maybe longer. My name is Candace Miller, and I am from Boston, Massachusetts. I am a marine biology PhD student, and in the summer of 2020, Right after COVID restrictions started easing up, I had the opportunity to conduct field research in Grosmorn National Park in Newfoundland. The park is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, famous for its geological features. The tablelands area exposes a section of the Earth's mantle that is normally buried miles beneath the surface. For a researcher studying coastal ecosystems and geological impacts on marine life, it was a dream location. I was staying at a Parks Canada research cabin near the coast, conducting a 3-week study on tidal zone organisms and collecting samples from Bon Bay, which is a large fjord that cuts into the park. The work was solitary but rewarding. My days consisted of early morning fieldwork, sample collection, data entry, and preparation for the next day. I would usually be in bed by 9 or 10 at night because I needed to be up before dawn to catch the tides. On the night of August 23rd, I was woken up around 1:30 in the morning by an unusual sound. At first I thought it was an animal outside the cabin, maybe a moose or a bear, but as I came fully awake, I realized the sound was more mechanical than biological. It was a pulsing drone, rhythmic and steady. I got out of bed and looked out the window toward the coast. What I saw made my breath catch. There were lights over Bon Bay, multiple lights arranged in a geometric formation, a hexagonal pattern hovering over the water about 500 meters offshore. The formation was rotating slowly, and the individual lights were changing colors, white to blue to green, cycling through in sequence. I grabbed my binoculars from the table and focused on the lights. Through the magnification, I could see that the lights were not separate objects. They were connected by a dark structure. It was a single large craft, and the lights were positioned around its perimeter. The craft was descending toward the water surface. I made a quick decision. I needed to see this more closely. I pulled on my jacket, grabbed my headlamp and my camera, and headed out of the cabin. The shore was about a 10-minute walk through the trees. I reached a coastal bluff that gave me a clear view of the bay. The craft was now on the water surface, or just above it, hovering maybe a foot off the waves. It was huge, comparable in size to a commercial fishing vessel. The water beneath the craft was glowing a luminescent green. Something was happening underwater. The surface was churning with activity. Fish, I realized. Marine life was reacting to whatever the craft was doing. I could see the water boiling with movement. Smaller objects were deploying from the craft into the water. Sphere-shaped objects about the size of basketballs self-illuminated. I counted 6 of them. They moved through the water like fish with smooth, coordinated movements. They were swimming in a search pattern, methodical and precise. Each sphere left a trail of bioluminescence behind it, creating glowing paths through the dark water. They appeared to be collecting something, taking samples from the water or from the marine life. One of the spheres surfaced near the shore, about 30 feet from where I stood on the bluff. It was close enough that I could see detail. The surface was smooth and featureless with no obvious propulsion system, yet it moved with purpose and control. The sphere rotated and a sensor array became visible. Multiple lenses or cameras focused and tracking. One of the lenses focused on me. I felt exposed, caught. The sphere began moving toward the shore, toward me. It exited the water completely, floating in the air now, hovering at my eye level as it approached. I could see my own reflection in its surface. But more than that, the sphere was projecting something. An image of my face, scanned and reproduced, displayed on its surface. It was testing me, analyzing me, trying to determine if I was intelligent. I spoke without thinking. I said, "What are you?" The sphere pulsed in response to my voice, the light within it brightening momentarily. An appendage extended from its body, a thin mechanical arm with a sampling tool at the end. The tool was approaching my face. I panicked. I ducked and ran back toward the tree line. The sphere pursued me. It moved smoothly and effortlessly, easily keeping pace with my running. I looked back and saw the other spheres emerging from the water. 5 more converging on the shore, all moving in my direction. 6 spheres pursuing me through the coastal meadow. They were faster than I was. One moved ahead and cut off my escape route back toward the cabin. I was surrounded. The spheres arranged themselves in a circular formation around me, all equidistant, creating a perfect geometric pattern. They began scanning simultaneously. Beams of light from each sphere, creating a laser grid across my body. The sensation was painful, burning. My skin felt like it was on fire where the lasers touched. I fell to the ground, overwhelmed by the sensation. The spheres hovered above me in their circle, One descended very close, maybe 2 feet above my face. An appendage extended, this one different from the first. It was needle-like, thin and precise. It was approaching my forehead, aimed at the center of my skull. I was screaming, unable to move, certain I was about to die or be abducted or worse. Then I heard a loud sound from the bay, a boat horn. The Coast Guard does routine night patrols through the area, and one of their vessels was entering the bay. The spheres reacted instantly. They broke formation and retreated toward the water at high speed. They returned to the main craft within seconds. The craft's lights intensified, becoming almost too bright to look at directly. It lifted from the water surface and accelerated upward. The entire departure took maybe 5 seconds. The craft rose straight up, disappearing into the night sky. By the time the Coast Guard vessel reached my location, there was nothing to see but dark water and an empty sky. 2 officers came ashore in a small boat. They had seen the lights from a distance and heard me screaming. They found me on the ground, my clothes singed with visible burns on my arms, face, and torso. They helped me to my feet and transported me back to their vessel. They radioed for medical assistance, and I was taken to the clinic in Rocky Harbor, the nearest town. The doctor who examined me was baffled. The burns were consistent with radiation exposure, but the hospital's equipment detected no radiation on my body or clothing. The burn patterns were unusual, arranged in geometric grids that matched the laser scan patterns. The RCMP interviewed me the following morning. The officers were surprisingly knowledgeable about UFO reports in the area. They told me that Gros Morne has a history of sightings, particularly in the Bonne Bay area and around the tablelands. There is a theory among some researchers that the geological uniqueness of the area attracts non-human interest. The exposed mantle rock, the mineral composition, something about the site draws attention. The Coast Guard filed an official report categorizing what they witnessed as unidentified aerial phenomenon. My research supervisor was notified and flew to Newfoundland immediately. The university wanted to downplay the incident. They were concerned about publicity, about the credibility of the research program. There was pressure on me to not discuss it publicly. I refused. I filed a detailed report with the Canadian UFO Survey, a civilian research organization that documents these cases. The burns took 6 weeks to heal completely. I have permanent scarring on my forearms in a grid pattern that matches exactly where those lasers touched me. I returned to complete my field research, but I insisted on having an assistant with me. I was not going to stay alone in that cabin again. There were no further incidents during the remainder of my time there. However, the water samples I collected from Bonne Bay on the night of the encounter showed unusual chemical signatures. Trace elements that should not have been present in seawater, at least not in those concentrations. I attempted to publish a research paper on the anomalous water chemistry, carefully avoiding any mention of UFOs. The paper was rejected by 3 journals before being accepted with significant caveats and a note that further study is needed to confirm these findings. I have continued researching coastal UFO encounters from around the world. There is a pattern. Sightings over oceans, bays, and large lakes often involve underwater activity. Objects entering the water, emerging from the water, or conducting operations just above the surface. The hypothesis I'm developing is that whoever or whatever they are monitoring ocean health, collecting marine samples, cataloging life forms. They are doing the same research I was doing, just with far more advanced technology. My career trajectory changed after Gros Morne. I now focus my research on unexplained marine phenomena. I frame it carefully using terms like unidentified rather than alien, maintaining academic language and scientific rigor. This allows me to continue my work without being completely dismissed by the scientific community. I have been contacted by other scientists who have had similar experiences. There is an informal network of researchers who have encountered things they cannot explain. We share information quietly, supporting each other while maintaining our public credibility. I still have photosensitivity from the burns. I have to wear high SPF sunscreen even on cloudy days. My skin never fully recovered its normal tolerance for UV exposure, but the physical scars are minor compared to the knowledge I gained. I am a scientist. I deal in observable, measurable phenomena. What I observed that night was real, measurable, and completely unexplainable by conventional science. They were studying our oceans, taking samples, cataloging life, just like I was doing. We were not alone in that research. And based on what I have learned since, we never have been. My name is Jose Martinez, and I am from San Antonio, Texas. I work as a commercial delivery driver, and I have been doing it for about 8 years now. Most of my work is local and regional, driving box trucks around Texas and neighboring states. I usually handle urban routes, deliveries to businesses and retail locations. So when my company asked me to take a special assignment delivering luxury goods to a resort near Jasper, Alberta, I was both excited and nervous. Excited because I had never been to the Canadian Rockies and the photos looked incredible. Nervous because I am not used to mountain driving, especially not with a large vehicle. The route from Calgary to Jasper takes you along the Icefields Parkway, which is Highway 93. It is considered one of the most scenic drives in North America, running right through the heart of the Canadian Rockies between Banff and Jasper. I left Calgary early in the morning around 5:30 so I could arrive at the resort by their checkout time. The sun was just starting to rise around 6 o'clock, and the light on those mountains was absolutely spectacular. Golden sunrise hitting snow-covered peaks, glaciers gleaming in the early light. It was beautiful enough that I almost forgot to pay attention to the road. The highway was nearly empty. Tourist season was just beginning, so there were not many vehicles on the road yet. I was driving a large box truck, not an 18-wheeler, but substantial enough that I had to be careful on the mountain curves. The scenery was so distracting that I had to remind myself to focus. Around 7 in the morning, I was passing the Columbia Icefield area. The glacier comes right down to near the highway, and you can see the ice field stretching up into the mountains. I noticed a reflection on the glacier, a bright point of light that I assumed was just the sunrise reflecting off the ice. But then the light moved. It was not stationary like a reflection would be. It was rising up from behind one of the mountain peaks. As it came into full view, I could see it was an object. Metallic, catching the morning sun, disc-shaped. It looked exactly like the classic flying saucer shape you see in movies and books. But this was real, solid, and far too large to be a helicopter or small plane. It was ascending rapidly, moving up from the valley into the open sky. Then a second object appeared from a completely different direction, coming from the north. Both objects were identical in appearance. The two objects converged above the highway ahead of me, meeting at an altitude I estimated to be around 1,000 feet. They stopped and hovered, positioned directly over the road. They appeared to be communicating with each other. Lights flashed between them in rapid sequences like they were exchanging signals. I slowed my truck and pulled onto the shoulder of the road. I grabbed my phone to record what I was seeing, but when I tried to open the camera app, it would not respond. The phone was working, I could see the home screen, but the camera simply would not activate. I gave up on recording and just watched through my windshield. A third object appeared, and this one was much larger than the first two. It emerged from behind Mount Athabasca, one of the massive peaks that dominates the area. This object was triangular in shape, dark in color, with lights positioned at each of the 3 corners. The size was staggering. I would estimate it was at least 200 feet per side, maybe larger. It moved with the same silent grace as the 2 disc-shaped craft. The 2 smaller objects moved to flank the triangle, positioning themselves on either side. All 3 craft hovered in formation directly above where my truck sat on the shoulder. Then they began descending, coming lower, approaching the highway. 500 feet, 400 feet, 300 feet. My initial wonder was turning into fear. They were coming too close. The triangle craft was now close enough that I could see surface details, panels, seams, technological structures covering its underside. It looked constructed, manufactured, designed. This was not a natural phenomenon. A beam of light shot from the center of the triangle, hitting the road surface about 50 feet ahead of my truck. The pavement was illuminated in a perfect circle of intense white light. Within that beam, something began to materialize. A figure forming from the light itself, solidifying from nothing into something solid. The beam retracted, but the figure remained, standing on the highway in front of my truck. It was tall, approximately 7 feet, with a slender build. The being appeared to be wearing a metallic suit. Or perhaps its skin was metallic. I could not tell which. The head was large and oval-shaped, with no visible features at first. It just stood there for a moment, motionless. Then it began walking toward my truck. The walk was methodical and purposeful, not threatening exactly, but deliberate. Each step was measured, mechanical in its precision. I locked my truck doors, which I immediately recognized as completely useless. If they could materialize beings out of light beams, a locked door was not going to stop them. The being stopped about 20 feet from my truck, its head tilted to one side, studying the vehicle. As I watched, facial features became visible. Large dark eyes, no visible nose, just a small mouth. The classic gray alien appearance, but taller and more substantial than typical descriptions. The being raised one hand in what appeared to be a greeting gesture, a universal sign of peaceful intent. I sat frozen in my seat, unsure how to respond. I did not exit the truck. Every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to stay inside, maintain some barrier between myself and this thing. The being lowered its hand. Its posture changed in a way that communicated disappointment, as though it had expected a different response. It turned and gestured toward the craft hovering overhead. A second beam of light shot down from the triangle. The being stepped into the beam and began to ascend, lifted back into the craft. All three objects began rising. The two disc-shaped craft accelerated first, shooting away at incredible speed and disappearing from view in less than 2 seconds. The triangle craft hovered for a moment longer. It rotated slowly until it was pointing directly at my truck. Then there was a flash of light from the triangle directed at me. Everything went white, blinding white light that filled my vision completely. I felt nothing, heard nothing, saw nothing but white. I regained consciousness, slumped over my steering wheel. The truck's horn was blaring because my weight was pressing against it. I sat up and the horn stopped. I was disoriented, my head pounding with a severe headache. I checked the time on my dashboard clock. It showed 11:47 in the morning. That could not be right. My last clear memory was around 7:20 in the morning. I had lost over 4 hours. I looked around. The truck was still on the shoulder where I had pulled over. The highway was empty. There was no sign of the craft or the being. I checked my fuel gauge. It showed nearly empty. When I had pulled over, it had been at 3/4 full. I had lost fuel somehow, burned through it while sitting stationary. I got out to inspect the truck exterior. There was no visible damage, but the entire vehicle was covered in a fine metallic dust, gray powder coating the truck from top to bottom. I rubbed some between my fingers. It felt strange, almost liquid in texture despite being a powder. It left a residue on my skin that I could not easily wipe off. I climbed back into the truck and started the engine. Everything seemed to function normally. I pulled back onto the highway and continued toward Jasper, driving slowly, checking my mirrors constantly. I felt violated somehow, like something had been done to me during those missing hours. When I reached Jasper, I went straight to the RCMP detachment before making my delivery. The officer who took my report was professional but skeptical. He wrote everything down, took photos of the metallic dust on my truck, but I could tell he thought I was making it up or had experienced some kind of mental episode. The delivery to the resort was 4 hours late. My supervisor was angry when I called to explain. I tried to tell him what happened, but halfway through the explanation, I realized how insane it sounded. I finished with vehicle malfunction and lost time, which was technically true. The resort manager was understanding and accepted the delivery without complaint. I drove back to Calgary that evening, constantly checking the sky, terrified the craft would return. Back in Texas, I went to a doctor to get checked out. The headaches had continued for days after the incident. The doctor found nothing wrong with me physically, but he referred me to a neurologist for the missing time and memory gaps. The neurologist suggested I might have had a seizure or some kind of dissociative episode, but I have never had seizures before or since, and the metallic dust on my truck was not a hallucination. I collected samples of it before I had the truck washed. I still have those samples in a jar in my garage. I tried to have the dust analyzed, but no lab I contacted would take the job seriously. One place quoted me thousands of dollars for a full chemical analysis, money I did not have. So the dust sits in my garage, physical evidence of something I cannot explain and cannot afford to prove. I also started experiencing strange dreams after the incident. Vivid, realistic dreams where I am inside a white room, surrounded by tall beings who are doing something to me. Medical procedures, examinations, tests. I wake up from these dreams with the same headache I had when I woke up in the truck that day. My company never asked me to drive in Canada again. I do not know if that is coincidence or if someone made a note in my file about the incident. I do not care. I would not take another Canadian mountain route even if they offered me double pay. Whatever I encountered on that highway was real. The missing time was real. The metallic dust was real. I do not have answers about what happened during those 4 hours, and maybe I am better off not knowing. But I think about it constantly. Where did they take me? What did they do? Why can I not remember? I joined an online support group for people who have experienced missing time and possible abductions. There are hundreds of members, maybe thousands, all with similar stories. Bright lights, missing time, physical evidence, recurring dreams of examinations. The group helped me understand that I am not alone in this experience and that I am not crazy. These encounters happen more frequently than people realize. They just do not get reported or taken seriously. I am still a delivery driver. I still work the same routes I always have. Mostly urban deliveries around Texas, but I avoid remote areas now. I do not take jobs that require driving through empty country, especially at night. And I watch the sky more than I used to. Always scanning, always looking for lights that do not belong. Because now I know what is out there. I have seen it. I have lost time to it. And I have physical evidence sitting in a jar in my garage that something happened to me on that beautiful morning in the Canadian Rockies. Something that defies explanation and haunts me still. My name is Gerald Hopkins, and I am from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I am a wildlife photographer by profession, and I have spent the last 20 years traveling to remote locations around the world to photograph animals in their natural habitats. I have been to Antarctica, the African savanna, the Amazon rainforest, and just about every other ecosystem you can imagine. In October of 2019, I traveled to Churchill, Manitoba, which is known as the polar bear capital of the world. The town sits on the western shore of Hudson Bay, and during October and November, polar bears congregate there waiting for the bay to freeze so they can hunt seals on the ice. I had arranged a 2-week photography expedition with a local guide service. We would be staying in a tundra lodge, a specialized facility built on enormous stilts to keep it above the reach of curious bears. The lodge was located about 20 miles outside of Churchill, surrounded by nothing but flat tundra, willows, and the occasional rocky outcropping. It was remote, isolated, and perfect for wildlife photography. There were 8 other photographers on this trip, along with 2 guides. We spent our days driving around in specialized tundra vehicles, massive all-terrain vehicles with huge tires that allow you to traverse the rough terrain without getting stuck. The days were productive. I got incredible shots of polar bears, Arctic foxes, caribou, and various bird species. The landscape was stark and beautiful in its own way. Endless flat tundra stretching to the horizon, painted in oranges and browns by the autumn vegetation. The sky was huge up there, unobstructed by trees or mountains. At night, we would return to the lodge, review our photos, have dinner, and turn in early because the good light for photography happened during sunrise and sunset. On the night of October 17th, I woke up around 2:30 in the morning needing to use the bathroom. The lodge was quiet, everyone else asleep. After using the facilities, I walked past the common area and noticed light coming through the windows. Not dawn light, it was far too early for that. This light was wrong. It was too bright, too white, and it was moving. I went to the window and looked out across the tundra. What I saw made absolutely no sense. There were lights in the sky, multiple lights arranged in a pattern that reminded me of a constellation. But these lights were moving, rotating slowly around a central point. I grabbed my camera and one of my telephoto lenses from my room. I did not even think about it, just operated on photographer instinct. I need to document this. By the time I got back to the window, the pattern had changed. The lights had arranged themselves into a straight line, perfectly evenly spaced. I started taking photos through the window, adjusting my settings for night photography, long exposures to capture the lights clearly. Through my viewfinder, I could see more detail. The lights were not just points. They were structured, connected to something larger. There was a dark shape between them, a massive object that was only visible when it passed in front of stars, blocking them from view. The object began descending, moving lower in the sky, coming closer to the ground. I realized it was heading toward the area near the lodge. I made a decision that I recognized was probably stupid. I put on my heavy parka, grabbed my camera gear, and went outside. The temperature was around -15 Celsius, cold enough that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. But I was dressed for it, and I needed to get clear shots without shooting through glass. I climbed down the exterior stairs from the lodge and stood on the tundra about 50 feet from the building. The craft was enormous. As it came lower, I could judge its size against the landscape, and it was easily the size of several football fields. The shape was difficult to describe. Not quite disc-shaped, not quite triangular. It was organic somehow, with curved edges and flowing lines. The lights I had seen were positioned around its perimeter, and they pulsed in sequence, creating waves of illumination that traveled around the craft's edge. The entire object was silent, completely silent. No engine noise, no mechanical sounds, nothing but the whistle of wind across the tundra. The craft stopped and hovered approximately 200 feet above the ground, maybe a quarter mile from where I stood. I was taking photos constantly, frame after frame, adjusting settings, changing lenses, documenting everything I could see. Then something changed. A section of the underside opened, and smaller objects began deploying from the craft. They were sphere-shaped, maybe 6 feet in diameter, glowing with an internal light. 5 of them descended from the mother craft and began moving across the tundra in different directions. They moved smoothly, hovering about 10 feet above the ground, scanning the terrain with beams of light. One sphere moved in my direction. I kept photographing, my professional instinct overriding my fear. The sphere approached to within maybe 30 feet and stopped. It hovered there, and I could feel it examining me. The sensation was palpable, like being studied by an intelligence that was trying to understand what I was. I lowered my camera and just looked at it. The sphere pulsed, its light brightening momentarily. Then it projected something. A holographic image appeared in the air between us. It showed Earth, our planet, rotating slowly. Then the image zoomed in, showing North America, then Canada, then the Hudson Bay area. It was showing me where I was, demonstrating understanding of geography and location. The hologram changed. Now it showed the solar system, the planets in their orbits, the sun at the center. One by one, the planets lit up, labeled with symbols I did not recognize. Then the view pulled back, showing nearby star systems, and one specific star was highlighted. The hologram zoomed into that system, showing planets I had never seen. One planet was highlighted, and the image zoomed in to show its surface. Oceans, continents, cities of some kind. Structures that were clearly artificial, but designed in ways that made no sense to my human eyes. This was their home. They were showing me where they came from. I do not know how long I stood there watching this display. It could have been minutes or hours. Time felt strange, elastic. The other 4 spheres had converged on a location about 100 yards from where I stood. They were examining something on the ground, scanning it with their lights, hovering around it in a circular formation. I wondered what they had found. A fox den? A caribou kill? What could possibly interest them? Then the spheres suddenly retreated. All 5 of them simultaneously shot back toward the mother craft at high speed. They disappeared back into the opening in the underside, and the opening sealed shut. The craft's lights intensified, becoming almost painful to look at. Then it accelerated upward, not gradually but instantly. One moment it was hovering 200 feet up. The next it was a point of light in the sky, and then it was gone completely. The entire departure took maybe 2 seconds. I stood there in the freezing darkness, staring at empty sky, trying to process what I had just witnessed. I looked down at my camera. According to the counter, I had taken over 300 photos. I checked the LCD screen to review the images. Nothing. Every single photo showed a black frame or an overexposed white frame. The images were useless, corrupted somehow. I tried different photos from the sequence. Same result. Whatever that craft was, it had interfered with my camera's ability to capture it properly. I checked the metadata on the files. The timestamps were wrong. The first photo showed a timestamp of 2:43 a.m. The last photo showed 5:51 a.m. Over 3 hours had passed, but my subjective experience had felt like maybe 30 minutes at most. I was starting to feel the cold seriously now. I had been outside for hours, standing relatively still. My fingers were numb even inside my gloves. My face was freezing. I went back to the lodge and climbed the stairs as quietly as I could. Inside it was warm and dark and quiet. Everyone else was still asleep. I checked the clock on the wall. It showed 5:57 a.m. I went to my room and sat on my bed, still wearing my parka, trying to make sense of what had happened. At breakfast, I mentioned to the group that I had seen strange lights in the night. One of the guides, a local Cree man named Thomas, nodded without surprise. He said that lights are seen regularly in the Churchill area. The indigenous communities have stories about them going back generations. Lights that come down from the sky, beings that examine the land and animals and occasionally interact with people. He said most locals do not talk about it with outsiders because they do not want to be dismissed as superstitious or primitive. But the sightings are common, documented informally within the communities. I spent the rest of the trip trying to recover my photos, running recovery software on my memory cards, attempting different techniques to salvage the images. Nothing worked. The files were corrupted beyond repair. The only evidence I had was my testimony and the bizarre timestamps on the corrupted files. When I returned to Minneapolis, I took my camera and memory cards to a data recovery specialist. They confirmed that the files had some kind of electromagnetic corruption, as though they had been exposed to a powerful magnetic field. The specialist had never seen corruption quite like it before. I filed a report with the Mutual UFO Network, a civilian research organization that documents these encounters. They were very interested, particularly because of the Churchill location. Apparently, northern Manitoba has a high frequency of reported sightings, though most go unreported because of the sparse population. The researcher I spoke with told me about dozens of similar accounts from the Hudson Bay area. Craft over the tundra, sphere-shaped drones examining the landscape, missing time, corrupted photographs. My experience fit a pattern. The missing time bothers me more than anything else. I have no memory of those 3 hours between my first photo and my last. Were those hours spent standing and watching the holographic display, or did something else happen, something I cannot remember? I have had recurring dreams since returning home. Dreams where I am inside a white room being examined by tall, thin beings. They are taking samples, running tests, communicating with each other in sounds I cannot understand. I wake from these dreams with the same numb feeling I had in my fingers that night on the tundra. I am a photographer. My career is built on visual evidence, on capturing moments and making them permanent. The fact that I witnessed something so extraordinary and have no photographic evidence is deeply frustrating. People ask me why I did not use my phone to record video. The truth is I did not even think of it. I was in photographer mode, operating on professional instinct, trying to get the best possible images with the best possible equipment. And whatever that craft was, it defeated my technology completely. I have returned to Churchill twice since that October night. Both times I hoped I might see the lights again, might get another chance to document them. Both trips were uneventful. No lights, no craft, no spheres. Just polar bears and tundra and the normal explainable world. But I know what I saw. I know I lost 3 hours of time. I know that something came down from the sky and examined the landscape around me. And I know they showed me their home world, sharing information I could not fully comprehend for reasons I cannot understand. The universe is far stranger and more populated than most people realize. And the Canadian Arctic, with its vast empty spaces and dark skies, seems to be a place where the boundary between our world and theirs grows thin. My name is Patricia Summers and I am from Charleston, South Carolina. I work as a high school science teacher, and I have always been passionate about astronomy and the natural sciences. In the summer of 2023, I decided to take a solo road trip through the Canadian Rockies during my summer break. I had always wanted to see the mountains, the glaciers, and experience the dark skies that are perfect for stargazing. I planned a 3-week trip that would take me through Banff and Jasper National Parks, staying at campgrounds and spending my evenings observing the night sky with my telescope. I arrived in Banff in early July, and the weather was perfect. Clear skies, warm days, cool nights. I set up camp at a backcountry campground near Lake Louise. It required a short hike to reach, maybe 2 miles from the parking area, which meant fewer people and darker skies. I was one of only 3 groups camping there that night. The other campers were a young couple at a site about 100 yards away, and a solo male hiker even farther down the trail. We exchanged pleasantries when I arrived, but otherwise kept to ourselves. After dinner, I set up my telescope. I had brought a decent amateur telescope, nothing professional, but good enough to observe planets, star clusters, and the occasional deep sky object. The sky that night was spectacular. The Milky Way was clearly visible as a dense band of stars across the sky. I spent a few hours observing Jupiter and its moons, Saturn's rings, and various star clusters. Around 11:30, I decided to take a break and just lay on my sleeping pad looking up at the stars with my naked eyes. That is when I noticed something moving. At first, I thought it was a satellite, which I had seen several times already that evening. But this object was moving differently. It was not following a straight path across the sky. It was zigzagging, making right-angle turns that no satellite or aircraft could make. I sat up and watched it more carefully. The object stopped moving completely and hung in the sky. Then a second object appeared, moving in the same erratic pattern. Then a third, a fourth, a fifth. 5 objects, all moving independently but somehow coordinated, all making impossible maneuvers. I looked through my telescope, trying to get a closer view. Through the magnification, I could see that these were not just points of light. They were structured objects, disc-shaped with lights arranged around their edges. As I watched, the 5 objects arranged themselves in a perfect pentagon formation. They hung there in that geometric pattern for maybe 30 seconds. Then all 5 objects shot toward a central point and merged into a single bright light. That single light began descending, coming down from the sky, growing larger as it approached. I realized with a mixture of excitement and fear that it was descending toward my location. I stood up from my telescope and watched as the light came lower and lower. It resolved into a craft as it approached, large, easily 50 or 60 feet in diameter, disc-shaped with a dome on top, the classic flying saucer shape. It was glowing with an internal light, but I could see the metallic structure beneath the glow. The craft stopped and hovered approximately 100 feet above the lake, maybe 200 yards from where I stood at my campsite. The water beneath it began to glow, reflecting the light from the craft. The entire scene was surreal, beautiful, and terrifying all at once. I heard a sound from the other campsites. The young couple had emerged from their tent and were standing outside, staring at the craft. The solo hiker was also visible, standing at his campsite with a flashlight in his hand. We were all witnessing this together. That fact was oddly comforting. I was not alone in seeing this. Whatever this was, there would be other witnesses. The craft began to rotate slowly. As it turned, I could see variations in the surface. Panels, seams, what looked like windows or ports. This was clearly a manufactured object, something built with purpose and technology. A beam of light shot down from the center of the craft, hitting the surface of the lake. The water within the beam began to behave strangely. It was swirling, being pulled upward against gravity. Water was being lifted into the craft, drawn up through the beam of light. They were collecting a water sample, I realized.
Taking a sample of the lake.
After maybe a minute, the beam retracted and the craft shifted position, moving to a different location over the lake. The beam shot down again, collecting another sample from a different spot. Then the craft moved toward the shore, toward the forested area near our campsites. The beam came down again, this time hitting the ground in a clearing about 50 yards from where I stood. I could see vegetation being illuminated in the beam, and I could see something being pulled up into the craft. Soil samples, plant samples, maybe insects or small animals. They were systematically collecting samples from the environment. The beam moved to another location, then another, creating a grid pattern of sample sites across the area. I fumbled for my phone, intending to record video. As soon as I activated the camera app, the phone's screen went black. The device had shut down completely. I tried to turn it back on, but it would not respond. I reached for my camera, the one I use for astrophotography. Same result. It would not turn on. Whatever the craft was emitting, it was interfering with electronics. My telescope was still set up, but I did not trust myself to look through it. I was worried that whatever energy was coming from that craft might damage my eyes if I looked at it through magnification. The craft moved closer to shore, and now the beam was scanning the campsite area. It swept across the young couple's tent, then across the trees, moving in our direction. I stood frozen, watching the beam approach. Part of me wanted to run into the forest and hide, but another part of me, the scientist and teacher part, wanted to stay and observe, to witness this and remember every detail. The beam swept across my campsite and I was bathed in light. The sensation was strange. Warmth, but also a tingling feeling all over my skin. Like static electricity, but more intense. The light was so bright that I had to close my eyes. Even through my closed eyelids, I could see the brightness. Then I heard a voice. Not out loud, but in my head. It said, "Do not be afraid. We mean no harm. We are studying." The voice had no gender, no accent, no emotion. It was just words appearing in my mind. I tried to respond, tried to think words back at it. I thought, "Who are you? Where are you from?" There was no response, just silence in my mind. The beam moved on, continuing its sweep of the area. It scanned the solo hiker's campsite, then moved back out over the lake. The craft rose higher, ascending to maybe 500 feet above the lake. All the lights on its surface began pulsing in unison, faster and faster. Then it shot upward at impossible speed. One moment it was there, the next it was a point of light, and then it was gone completely. The entire departure took maybe 2 seconds. The three of us stood in our respective campsites looking at each other across the distance, all of us clearly shaken. The young man from the couple called out, "Did you all see that?" We confirmed that yes, we had all seen it. We walked toward each other, meeting in the clearing between our campsites. We introduced ourselves. The couple were Sarah and Michael from Vancouver. The solo hiker was named David from Toronto. We spent the next hour comparing experiences, making sure we had all seen the same thing. We had our descriptions matched. We all agreed that we needed to report this to park authorities in the morning. We also agreed that we were not going to be able to sleep after what we had just witnessed. We built a fire in the communal fire pit and sat up for the rest of the night, talking, watching the sky and trying to process what we had experienced. Sarah mentioned that her watch had stopped. We all checked our watches and phones. Mine had stopped at 11:48, right around when I first noticed the objects in the sky. Michael's watch showed the same time. David's phone was dead, but his mechanical watch was still running and showed the current time as 3:27 a.m. We had lost time, though none of us had memory gaps. The encounter had felt like maybe 45 minutes, and according to David's watch, it had been about 3.5 hours. At first light, we packed our camps and hiked out to the parking area. We drove together to the Parks Canada office and filed a report with park rangers. The ranger who took our statement was professional and thorough. He wrote everything down, took our contact information, and told us that he would forward the report to the appropriate authorities. He did not seem surprised or skeptical, which I found interesting. He mentioned that there had been other reports from Banff and Jasper, though he did not provide specifics. Over the next few days, we were contacted by the RCMP, who conducted follow-up interviews. We were also contacted by Transport Canada, who asked detailed questions about the craft's appearance, movements, and any effects it had on our equipment. All four of us had experienced electronic failures. Phones, cameras, watches. My telescope was also damaged. When I tried to use it the next night, the electronics that control the motorized mount were dead. The optics were fine, but the electronic components were fried. We formed a group chat, the four of us, and stayed in contact. We compared notes on physical effects we experienced in the days and weeks following the encounter. All four of us reported sleep disturbances, vivid dreams that felt more like memories, dreams of being inside a white room, of being examined by beings we could not clearly see. Sarah developed a rash on her arms where the beam had touched her. It lasted for about 2 weeks before fading. David reported severe headaches for a month following the encounter. I did research on Banff and Jasper sightings when I returned home to South Carolina. The Canadian Rockies have a long history of UFO activity, reports going back decades, maybe longer. Indigenous peoples in the area have traditional stories about lights in the sky and beings from the stars. Modern reports describe craft over lakes and glaciers, often appearing to collect samples of water, ice, soil, and vegetation. The pattern is consistent. They seem to be conducting environmental research, studying the ecosystem. As a science teacher, I try to approach everything with skepticism and critical thinking. I teach my students to question, to demand evidence, to not accept claims without proof. But I also teach them that science is about observation and being willing to change your understanding when presented with new data. I observed something that night that I cannot explain with current scientific understanding. I have 3 other credible witnesses who saw exactly what I saw. We have physical evidence in the form of damaged electronics. We filed official reports with multiple government agencies. This happened. It was real. What I cannot explain is who they are, where they came from, or why they are collecting samples from Canadian lakes and forests. But the evidence suggests they have been doing this for a long time, systematically studying our planet. The voice in my head said they were studying. That implies research, science, curiosity. Perhaps they are not so different from us in that regard. We send probes to other planets, collect samples, study ecosystems. Maybe we are being studied the same way we study Mars or Europa. The thought is humbling and unsettling in equal measure. We are not the observers. We are the observed. And the Canadian wilderness, with its remote locations and dark skies, appears to be one of their primary research sites.